Hello, Upcountry Literary Festival. I'm Jonathan Haupt, the Executive Director of our nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center here in beautiful Beaufort by the Sea, where I am today. Honored to be back as part of this festival again. I am the co-editor of an anthology called Our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy, which was published by the University of Georgia Press and has since gone on to win 17 book awards and spawn an ongoing series of writers' conferences and an art exhibit and all sorts of interesting things that none of us ever expected when we started working on the project. Our Prince of Scribes is a collection of essays by 67 writers who knew Pat Conroy at some point during a roughly 50-year span of Pat's writing life. Some of them knew him very early on as high school classmates at Beaufort High School right here in town. Others, like me, knew him much later in life. I'm going to read for you passages from 3 of the essays. When I do this live, it's kind of bit more enjoyable to have about 12 selections and let the audience tell me what they want to hear. But for purposes of our video today, these selections have been made on your behalf. We'll see if we've picked some good ones for you. The first one is a short passage from my own introduction to the book, Our Prince of Scribes, about a half a page here. And this is describing a bit of my relationship with Pat. I was the director of the University of South Carolina Press, and Pat Conroy and I were partners together during the last 5 or so years of his life. We created a fiction imprint together called Story River Books, which gave Pat and I the chance to publish, ultimately champion, 22 novels and short story collections, some of which have gone on to win major awards as well. It more importantly gave Pat a chance to be a teacher again, to not only to the writers that we were publishing in Story River, but to his own readers, to show them that these writers in the Story River project were worthy of their attention in the same way that they admired and followed Pat. They could support these writers as well. And that's really what this excerpt is about. This is from the end of my introduction to Our Prince of Scribes. Following a particularly lively Evening with Story River Books event in front of an audience of several hundred at Furman University, Pat and I settled at a table in front of a long line of fans eager for his autograph. Pat signed for 3 hours that night, always striving to carry on meaningful conversations with each reader in the line, letting them know how much he treasured his audience. While the majority of books put in front of him were his own, he was delighted whenever a Story River book by another writer was extended to him to inscribe. At the end of the night, when all of the writers had left and only Pat, venue staff, my wife, and I remained, Pat rose at last from the table and bellowed, "Haupt! I've never worked so hard in my life selling books by other writers." "Your writers," I corrected him. "Our writers," he corrected me, ever the good teacher. "And do you love it?" I asked him. He paused for a moment, just long enough for a twinkle, a chuckle, and a dropping of his curmudgeonly facade. Then came the truth-teller's honest answer. Yes, I do." Our Prince of Scribes is a collective return of Pat Conroy's faith in other writers, a giving back of the great love Pat entrusted with each of us, represented in this collection, and in so many other writers whose lives he touched and whose hearts he opened with the overarching message of his timeless body of work: you are not alone. Pat's legacy is still growing. His star is still ascending through his beloved books, through our remembrances of his instructive example, through the brilliant writings of the Story River Books family he forged, and even a larger tribe of writers he inspired, and through the work of the new Pat Conroy Literary Center established in his honor and his stead. This collection is our gift to readers and to writers. We honor Pat by sharing his stories and our own, our truths as we know them to be. "Tell me a story," Pat would say. These are the stories writers tell of Pat Conroy, our friend, our teacher, our Prince of Scribes. When Our Prince of Scribes came out, we immediately started to get the most amazing responses from Pat's readers. People were deeply moved by the collection, by the candor of what our 67 writers were able to share, and by the thrill of getting to hear Pat Conroy stories that had never been told before outside the context of the book. But I remember an email I got fairly early in the process from one of Pat's Beaufort High School students. Pat taught at Beaufort High for 2 years before going out to Defusky. And she sent this email that said, when I saw that you and all the other writers were putting this book together of your Pat stories, I knew immediately I wanted to buy it, but I wasn't sure I ever wanted to read it because I didn't want to be sad 67 times. Well, you won't be. You certainly won't be. It's not a collection of 67 eulogies. And I want to read one of the stories that really carries a tremendous sense of humor and charm, and it's from a writer people perhaps don't always think of as being funny, Ron Rash, best known perhaps for books like Serena and World Made Straight, One Foot in Eden, Burning Bright, Chemistry, just an amazing writer of novels, short stories, poetry. And this is probably one of the funniest stories in the collection. And that's all the setup I'm going to give for it. One thing I learned early about Pat was that any story I told, he would top. I suspect that if I said my grandmother had been eaten by a grizzly bear, Pat would have a grandmother eaten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex. My favorite example of this took place one night when we were eating dinner. The subject of dispiriting book signings came up. I told Pat that I had endured the worst such signing ever. Let's hear it, Pat said. So I told about an event years earlier when I had done a reading and a signing at a small library in South Carolina. Books would be available for sale, my host assured me. The books were indeed there, but the audience was not. 3 people showed up. The person who'd invited me, a friend of his who promptly fell asleep, and a grim-faced nun who appeared to have come solely as an act of penance. After my event, I dutifully went, pen in hand, to the signing table. None of the 3 came near the table. 0 books sold, I told Pat. 0. No one even picked up one to pretend they might buy it. They didn't even touch a book. It doesn't get any worse than that. Pat looked at me, a twinkle in his eye. Oh, no, 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 Pat said in his way. I can top that. How do you top 0 books sold? I asked. I'll tell you how, Pat answered, and began a story about a book signing soon after self-publishing The Boo. The signing was in a chain bookstore. Pat had been given a chair and a small table on which he'd placed copies of the book. He'd sat and waited for customers to come his way. As the 2-hour signing was about to expire, Pat still hadn't sold a book. Few people had even made eye contact. But then an elderly man did. He came over and spent the next few minutes talking to Pat, finally picking up a copy of the book to peruse. After a while longer, he decided to purchase a copy, but only if Pat would personalize the book for him. So Pat asked the man's name, wrote the name and a few words, then signed and dated the book. The man thanked Pat and was about to go pay for the book. Then, according to Pat, the man took one step toward the checkout counter, fell to the floor, and died. That's not 0, Pat said, since the book could neither be sold nor resold. That's -1, Rash. Did that story ever actually happen? Maybe, maybe not. But the telling of the story definitely happened, and it meant a lot to Ron in a moment when he needed his spirits lifted in that wonderful, humorous, competitive way that only Pat Conroy could do. So I'm grateful to Ron for sharing that story, and grateful to everyone else who shared theirs in Our Prince of Scribes as well. The last excerpt I want to read is from an essay written by Nicole Seitz, who is also the co-editor of Our Prince of Scribes. Nicole is an exceptionally talented novelist with 7 books to her credit, most recently The Cage Maker, which Pat Conroy and I selected and ultimately published in Story River Books. Nicole is also a marvelous artist and a masterful teacher as well, but she didn't have that deeply personal, sustained relationship with Pat Conroy that many of us in the book had. And she writes about that rather beautifully. And I want to read, in closing here, from the end of Nicole's essay, which is titled A Name to Remember. I do know this, even in death, Pat is still graciously giving. I will spend the rest of my writer days trying to honor this man. It is with sincere regret that I didn't realize sooner that he was just a man, and nothing as large as the pedestal I'd put him on. If I'd figured that out sooner, I might have allowed myself into his orbit. But some people shine so brightly in this earthly life that it can be blinding. Pat Conroy was no god. He was simply a man, a flawed, authentic, brilliantly talented man, bestowed with gifts of the pen and the heart, both of which he used well. In the end, it doesn't matter if he knew my name, because I know his, and it's one I hope to help carry on. Thank you all.